The morning after the murder dawned grey and uncertain, the kind of September day that seemed to hesitate between summer and autumn, unable to commit to either season. Miss Marple had slept poorly, her mind returning again and again to that moment when Margaret's anxiety had first broken the surface of the festival's carefully maintained composure. She rose at her customary hour of 6 o'clock, prepared her simple breakfast of toast and marmalade, and settled herself in the small sitting room with the morning's edition of the local newspaper. The headline was predictable: "Prominent businessman found dead at church festival." The article, however, contained several details that Miss Marple found worth noting. Howard Blackwell had been struck down sometime between 3 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, according to the preliminary examination. The letter opener, which belonged to Blackwell himself, retrieved from his study desk by the police, had been the murder weapon. There was no suggestion of robbery. Blackwell's wallet remained in his jacket pocket, containing a considerable sum in banknotes. His watch, a rather handsome gold piece, remained on his wrist. By mid-morning, Constable Ashford had called at her cottage. Peter was a conscientious young man, earnest in his way, though Miss Marple had long ago concluded that his abilities did not extend much beyond the competent management of petty squabbles and the occasional bicycle theft. "Inspector Crane would very much like to speak with you, Miss Marple," he said, shifting his weight uncomfortably on her doorstep. "Given your proximity to the scene and your reputation for observation." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I'm flattered that Inspector Crane has heard of my small hobby of noticing things. Do come in, Peter. I've just put the kettle on." The inspector arrived within the hour, a man of perhaps 55 with the weathered face of someone who had spent decades cataloguing human wickedness. He was competent in a thorough, methodical way that Miss Marple respected, even if she suspected his conclusions might occasionally run ahead of his evidence. "Now then, Miss Marple," he began, once they had been settled with tea in her sitting room, "I understand you were present throughout the festival and observed the victim's movements." "I observed very little, I'm afraid," Miss Marple replied truthfully. "I was seated in one location for most of the afternoon, and my view was necessarily limited. However, I did notice one or two small things that might be of interest." The inspector leaned forward slightly, his notebook already open. "Please, go ahead." "When Howard Blackwell was conversing with Dr. Hartley near the vegetable displays, there was a moment when Dr. Hartley's hand brushed against Mr. Blackwell's arm. It was a perfectly ordinary gesture, you understand, but Mr. Blackwell pulled away rather sharply. The gesture was quite deliberate, and it seemed to cause Dr. Hartley considerable discomfort, not the discomfort of social embarrassment, but something rather deeper." The inspector made a note. "You're suggesting tension between them?" "I'm suggesting nothing whatsoever," Miss Marple said mildly. "I'm merely reporting what I observed. The interpretation is for others to make." Over the next hour she described the expressions she had noted: Margaret's anxiety before the body was discovered, Timothy Ashford's pallor, Constance Ashford's rather too firm grip on her husband's arm. She mentioned the punch glass, which seemed to have been abandoned near the copse, and the fact that Howard Blackwell had been, by all accounts, a man drinking punch at a church festival when one would have expected him to be sampling something rather stronger from the vicar's modest supply of sherry. "He was a cautious man with his consumption," Miss Marple observed. "I've known him for many years, and I cannot recall ever seeing him take more than a single glass of wine at any gathering. It seemed rather curious that he should be drinking punch at all." The inspector's expression suggested that he found this detail of little consequence. He departed after another hour, promising that the investigation would proceed with utmost efficiency, and Miss Marple returned to her sitting room with the sense that she had planted several small seeds whose growth would depend entirely upon whether Inspector Crane possessed the patience to nurture them. It was late afternoon when Timothy Ashford appeared at her door, his usually composed manner noticeably fractured. He was a man of 42, successful in his legal practice, with the kind of careful reputation that marked someone who had learned early that scandal could derail even the most promising of lives. "Miss Marple, I wonder if I might speak with you," he said, his voice carefully lowered despite the emptiness of the street behind him. "Not as a constable's inquiry, but simply as someone whose judgment I have always respected. She invited him inside, though she suspected she knew what was troubling him. Timothy had been distressed when the body was discovered, more distressed than might be expected for a mere acquaintance of the deceased. "It's regarding my late mother's estate," he began, once they were settled. Howard served as trustee for many years. There were certain irregularities that came to light only recently, matters that, if they became public knowledge, would reflect poorly on both my family and on Howard's reputation. Miss Marple listened carefully, noting not only what he said, but the particular way in which he phrased his concerns. There were, it seemed, many people in Thornfield who had reasons to wish Howard Blackwell ill. The question, as always, was which reason had proved deadly enough to move someone toward murder. Miss Marple listened to Timothy's explanation with the careful attention of someone who had learned that confessions, even partial ones, often revealed as much by what was omitted as by what was explicitly stated. The irregularities he described, certain withdrawals from the estate account that had not been properly documented, investments made without consultation, were serious enough to suggest impropriety, though whether Howard Blackwell had acted from deliberate dishonesty or mere negligence remained unclear. "And your wife knows of these difficulties?" Miss Marple asked gently, once Timothy had finished his account. Timothy's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Constance suspects something is amiss. She has always been remarkably perceptive about such matters. She urged me to confront Howard about the discrepancies, but I was attempting to handle the situation discreetly. A man in my position cannot afford the sort of scandal that would accompany a public dispute with a trusted family advisor." "No, I imagine not," Miss Marple agreed, "though it strikes me that the scandal might be somewhat less severe than whatever consequences might result from allowing the matter to fester unresolved." Timothy rose to leave shortly thereafter, clearly relieved to have unburdened himself of at least a portion of his anxiety. Yet as Miss Marple watched him depart down the garden path, she found herself returning to that moment at the festival when she had observed Constance's grip on his arm. There had been something almost proprietary in that gesture, as though she were anchoring him against some imminent drift toward dangerous revelation. The following morning brought a visitor of quite a different character. Dr. Hartley arrived at Miss Marple's door with the purposefulness of a man who had resolved to address a matter head-on, though his expression suggested that the resolution had cost him considerably. "Miss Marple, I felt it incumbent upon me to speak with you before the inspector draws his own conclusions about our conversation at the festival," he said, dispensing with pleasantries in a manner quite unlike his usual courteous demeanor. "I know you observed something of our interaction, and I wish to explain it before misunderstanding takes root." They settled in the sitting room, where the morning light fell across the worn chintz of the furniture, illuminating dust motes that drifted like tiny evidence of time's passage. Dr. Hartley was a man of 63, widowed for 7 years, with the kind of distinguished appearance that had made him popular in the village for decades. Yet his hands trembled slightly as he accepted the offered tea. "Howard Blackwell and I had a disagreement of some years' standing," he began carefully. "It concerned a matter of medical ethics that I need not elaborate upon. When he attempted to touch my arm at the festival, a gesture of what he presumably intended as reconciliation, I reacted poorly. My withdrawal was not a reflection of any sinister intent on my part, but rather a manifestation of old hurt that I had not adequately resolved." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And yet your conversation with Mr. Blackwell before that moment seemed cordial enough." "Yes, well, Howard had a talent for civility that masked certain of his less admirable qualities," Dr. Hartley replied. "He approached me specifically to discuss the possibility of settling our differences. I was considering his proposal when he made the gesture that prompted my rather ungracious response." "A proposal of tea sort?" Miss Marple inquired. Dr. Hartley's hesitation was brief but telling. He suggested that certain matters from our past might be best left undiscussed, and that he would be prepared to make a financial contribution to the village medical fund as a gesture of his goodwill toward moving forward. "In other words," Miss Marple said mildly, "he was attempting to purchase your silence. One might characterize it that way, though Howard would never have phrased it so crudely," Dr. Hartley acknowledged. "The point is that I had resolved to refuse his offer. I had concluded that some matters of principle cannot be traded away, regardless of the personal cost. I was about to communicate this decision when the discovery of the body interrupted our discussion. After Dr. Hartley's departure, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the emerging pattern with the kind of satisfaction that came from watching a particularly complex piece of needlework gradually reveal its underlying design. Howard Blackwell, it seemed, had been a man engaged in a delicate balancing act, maintaining the appearance of respectability while simultaneously managing a series of secrets, each one potentially damaging enough to warrant careful handling. She was arranging her thoughts when a knock at the door announced the arrival of a third unexpected visitor. This time it was Margaret Blackwell, the deceased's cousin and the woman who had first noticed his absence at the festival. She appeared diminished somehow, as though the shock of discovery had stripped away some essential layer of her composure. "I wanted to speak with you privately," Margaret said, settling into the offered chair with the careful deliberation of someone managing genuine distress. "About Howard's will. He left me everything, you see. The house, the mill, his considerable investments. The solicitor informed me this morning. And I realized, almost at once, that Inspector Crane would certainly view this as a motive for murder." Miss Marple regarded her with an expression of gentle interest. "And is it, do you think, a motive for your having murdered your cousin?" Margaret's answer came swiftly, almost reflexively. "Absolutely not. I had no need of Howard's money. My own circumstances are quite comfortable. But the inspector will assume the worst, and I simply cannot bear the thought of being suspected of such a terrible crime." As Margaret wept softly into the handkerchief Miss Marple provided, the elderly detective found herself considering a question that seemed to grow more pressing with each new revelation. If so many people had reasons to wish Howard Blackwell dead, how was one to determine which of them had actually wielded the letter opener? By the third day following the murder, Inspector Crane had begun to demonstrate the particular frustration that came from investigating a crime where motives seemed to flourish like weeds in an untended garden. Miss Marple observed his agitation during a follow-up visit, noting how his fingers drummed against the arm of her chair and how his questions had taken on a slightly defensive quality, as though he were preparing arguments against criticisms he had not yet heard. "Everyone in this village seems to have had some grievance against Blackwell," he said, almost to himself. "The solicitor, the doctor, the widow who will inherit his considerable estate. Even the mill workers have begun whispering about unpaid wages and unsafe working conditions. The man was positively surrounded by people who might have wished him harm. And yet," Miss Marple observed quietly, "someone actually did wish him harm, sufficiently to act upon that wish with considerable deliberation and physical courage. It is rather a different matter entirely, wouldn't you say? The eye." The Spectre's gaze sharpened. "You think the murderer was chosen from among a select few, rather than from the broader pool of those with general grievances?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that whoever wielded that letter opener must have possessed not only motive, but also opportunity, and, crucially, a specific trigger. Some particular event or confrontation that transformed general resentment into immediate action. It was this observation that seemed to galvanize the inspector into more focused inquiry. He departed within the hour, and Miss Marple found herself alone once more with her thoughts and the afternoon edition of the newspaper, which had begun to report on certain financial irregularities in the management of Blackwell's mill. An employee had come forward to suggest that wages had been systematically underpaid and the difference quietly diverted to Blackwell's personal accounts. The story was spreading through the village with the inexorable momentum of genuine scandal. The following morning brought news that shifted the investigation's focus considerably. A young woman named Eleanor Hartley, the doctor's daughter, had been discovered attempting to withdraw a substantial sum of money from her father's bank account. When questioned, she had confessed to a secret engagement with one of the mill workers, a man whose wages had been reduced by Blackwell's manipulations to such an extent that he could not afford to marry without some financial assistance from Eleanor's side. The revelation caused a considerable stir in the village, particularly when it emerged that Dr. Hartley had forbidden the engagement and had been attempting to prevent his daughter from throwing away her future on a man of insufficient means. Eleanor, in her desperation, had determined to act without his permission. This news prompted yet another visitor to Miss Marple's sitting room, Eleanor herself, a girl of perhaps 23, with her father's refined features and an expression that suggested a spirit considerably more obstinate than her father's gentle nature. "I know what people are saying," Eleanor said without preamble, "that father killed Mr. Blackwell because of what he had done to the mill workers, or because of some ancient disagreement, or because Mr. Blackwell threatened to expose some secret that would ruin father's reputation. But it's all lies. Father was incapable of violence. He was almost too gentle, too willing to forgive even those who had wronged him terribly, and yet he attempted to prevent your engagement to a man whose circumstances had been damaged by Mr. Blackwell's dishonesty," Miss Marple observed. "It seems your father was capable of exerting considerable force when it came to protecting what he valued." Eleanor's chin lifted defiantly. "That's different. Father's opposition to my engagement wasn't violent. It was merely paternal concern taken to an excessive degree. He would never have harmed Mr. Blackwell, no matter what wrongs had been committed." After Eleanor's departure, Miss Marple sat for some time in contemplative silence, her hands folded in her lap, her expression remote in the way that suggested her mind was engaged in careful consideration of multiple threads, each requiring examination, each demanding to be woven into a coherent pattern. It was Constance Ashford who appeared at her door late that afternoon, her usual composure noticeably absent. She was a woman of 40 years, intelligent and capable, with the kind of careful management of her appearance and manner that suggested someone acutely aware of how easily reputation could be compromised by even the smallest indiscretion. "I've come to tell you something that I have not yet shared with the inspector," Constance said, settling into a chair with visible reluctance. "Something that involves Timothy and that I've been attempting to manage privately." Miss Marple waited, sensing that Constance required neither prompting nor interruption. Howard Blackwell was blackmailing Timothy. Constance continued quietly. "Not regarding the estate irregularities, though those certainly provided the opportunity. No, it was regarding something else entirely, something that, if disclosed, would have destroyed Timothy's career and our marriage both." "And what was this something?" Miss Marple asked. Constance's hands twisted together in her lap. "Timothy had an affair some years ago. Before we were married, you understand, but still something that would be considered scandalous in certain circles. Howard somehow discovered this indiscretion and had been using knowledge of it to manipulate Timothy into silence regarding the financial improprieties. It was a form of leverage that gave Howard considerable power over my husband's actions and decisions." As Constance spoke, Miss Marple found herself observing not the words themselves, but the particular quality of Constance's anxiety. There was something in her manner that suggested she was revealing only a portion of what she actually knew, that some crucial element. "And yet," Miss Marple said gently, "Timothy's past indiscretion, while certainly embarrassing, would hardly constitute grounds for murdering Howard Blackwell. There are other elements to this situation that you have not yet mentioned." Constance's composure fractured visibly. She rose from her chair and walked to the window, her back to Miss Marple, her shoulders rigid with the effort of maintaining control. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. Howard was threatening to reveal not only Timothy's affair, but also the identity of the woman involved. It was someone Timothy had cared for quite deeply. Someone who was, at the time, already married to another man. The revelation would have exposed not merely Timothy's moral failing, but also cast suspicion upon the woman and her marriage, which had subsequently dissolved for entirely unrelated reasons. "I see," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "And this woman, is she someone still residing in Thornfield?" The long silence that followed her question contained its own answer. Constance turned slowly from the window, her face pale but composed once more, as though she had made some internal decision and had reconciled herself to whatever consequences might follow. "Yes," she said at last, "it was Margaret Blackwell, Howard's cousin. Timothy and Margaret were involved for approximately 4 months before Timothy ended the affair and subsequently met me. It was a youthful indiscretion on both their parts, brought to an end before it could cause genuine harm. But Howard discovered the affair years later and had been using knowledge of it to maintain control over Timothy ever since. The revelation hung in the air between them, its implications multiplying like patterns in a kaleidoscope. Margaret, then, had possessed not only the motive of financial inheritance, but also the far more personal motivation of protecting a secret that could have exposed her to considerable shame. And yet, Miss Marple reflected, there was something about the revelation that seemed almost too convenient, too readily offered as explanation for a crime far more complex than a simple blackmail arrangement. After Constance departed, Miss Marple found herself returning to her small study, where she kept various reference materials and, more importantly, her collection of observation notes accumulated over decades of village life. She withdrew a small leather-bound notebook and began to review her entries from the weeks preceding the murder. There had been a Age Council meeting some 6 weeks prior, where Howard Blackwell had been discussed in relation to a proposed new housing development at the village's edge. Miss Marple had noted, almost without thinking, that Dr. Hartley had seemed particularly animated in his opposition to the project, while Timothy Ashford had remained remarkably quiet throughout the discussion. Margaret Blackwell had not attended the meeting at all. She turned to an earlier entry dated from a garden party some 3 months prior. Eleanor Hartley had been present, and Miss Marple had observed the young woman engaged in animated conversation with a mill worker named James Garrett. She had noted that Dr. Hartley had arrived late and had appeared distinctly displeased to find his daughter in such close association with a young man of modest circumstance. But there was another entry, one that Miss Marple had initially catalogued as mere social observation. It concerned a seemingly chance encounter between Howard Blackwell and Constance Ashford outside the village post office. Miss Marple had noted that Constance had appeared startled upon seeing Blackwell, and that the two had exchanged words in low voices, their conversation concluding with Constance turning away quite abruptly. At the time, Miss Marple had attributed this to ordinary social awkwardness, but now, with the revelation of Constance's knowledge regarding Timothy's affair, the interaction took on rather different significance. That evening, Inspector Crane arrived at Miss Marple's door with the air of a man who has begun to sense that the threads he has been following are leading him in circles rather than toward any meaningful destination. "I've been reconsidering your earlier observation," he said without preamble. "The notion that the murderer must have possessed not only motive but also some specific trigger. What might constitute suck? A trigger in your estimation?" "A confrontation," Miss Marple replied. "A moment in which someone felt backed into a corner, in which their options for maintaining their position or protecting their interests had been suddenly and drastically narrowed." The punch glass that was discovered near the body, had it been examined for contents? The inspector's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The residue suggested that it had contained something other than the punch that was being served at the festival. "Our analysis is still incomplete, but preliminary findings suggest the presence of a sedative compound." Then someone, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, had resolved to incapacitate Howard Blackwell before confronting him. This suggests not a crime of passion, but rather a calculated action. Someone who wished to ensure that Mr. Blackwell could not cry out or escape. Someone who needed to conduct a private conversation in a public location without risk of interruption. The inspector leaned forward slightly. And what manner of conversation might warrant such elaborate preparation? "One," Miss Marple said, "in which the stakes were sufficiently high that ordinary civility and discretion could no longer be maintained. A conversation in which someone felt compelled to demand either silence or revelation, confession or destruction." As the inspector departed with renewed purposefulness, Miss Marple found herself turning back to her notebooks once more, searching for that single detail that she had observed but not fully understood, the small thread that, when properly pulled, might unravel the entire careful construction of deception that had culminated in Howard Blackwell's death beneath the beech trees. The discovery that Howard Blackwell had been sedated before his murder fundamentally altered the investigation's trajectory. Inspector Crane, working with considerable greater focus, now that he possessed a concrete fact upon which to build his theories, began to systematically examine the movements of those present at the festival during the critical period between 3 and 4 o'clock. The sedative, once fully analyzed, proved to be a compound commonly found in sleeping draught preparations, the sort of medication that a medical professional would have easy access to, or indeed anyone with a family member in the medical profession. This observation, while narrowing the field somewhat, did not eliminate any of the primary suspects. Dr. Hartley had access to such compounds by virtue of his profession. Eleanor, as his daughter, might have done so as well. And Timothy Ashford, who maintained a well-stocked medicine cabinet like most respectable households, could have obtained the substance without particular difficulty. It was on the 4th day following the murder that Miss Marple received an unexpected summons. Inspector Crane wished her to accompany him to Blackwell's residence, where certain documents had been discovered that he felt might benefit from her perspective. This request, while unusual, struck Miss Marple as entirely reasonable, and she accepted with her customary grace. The Blackwell house was a handsome Victorian structure situated on the most elevated point of Thornfield, affording its owner extensive views across the village and the surrounding countryside. It was precisely the sort of residence one might expect to be occupied by a man of considerable wealth and social standing, well-maintained, formally furnished, and utterly devoid of any suggestion of the secrets that had festered within its walls. The study, where the documents in question had been discovered, revealed itself to be a space of considerable organization. Everything appeared to be filed with meticulous care, arranged according to some system that Howard Blackwell had apparently maintained with characteristic precision. The inspector directed Miss Marple's attention to a particular drawer, within which lay several folders containing correspondence of a rather delicate nature. "We've found letters," the inspector explained, "from multiple individuals. Threatening letters, some of them. Others attempting to negotiate in exchange for silence. There appears to have been a rather extensive network of people engaged in various attempts to either appease or coerce Mr. Blackwell into abandoning his various schemes." Miss Marple examined the letters with careful attention. One was from Dr. Hartley, dating from some 18 months prior, in which the doctor had offered a substantial sum of money in exchange for the destruction of certain documents relating to their past disagreement. Another was from Timothy Ashford, considerably more recent, pleading with Blackwell to reconsider his threats and suggesting that such actions were beneath a man of Blackwell's social standing. But it was a third letter that caused Miss Marple to pause, her attention becoming notably focused. It was written in an unfamiliar hand, the penmanship hurried and somewhat erratic, and it was addressed simply to H.B. without any formal salutation. "You have destroyed everything that mattered to me," the letter read, "and you persist in your cruelty as though it were some form of entertainment. I cannot allow this to continue. I will not allow it to continue. You will answer for what you have done, and the answer will be written in your own blood if necessary." The letter was unsigned and undated, but there was something in its intensity, in the particular phrasing of its threats, that suggested someone driven to the very edge of desperation. "Do you recognize the handwriting?" the inspector asked. Miss Marple studied the letter once more, considered. "Ring it from multiple angles, comparing it to the other documents present in the drawer. I would require the opportunity to examine other samples," she said at last, "but my initial impression is that this letter was written by someone in considerable emotional distress. The pressure of the pen varies considerably throughout, suggesting an individual who was struggling to maintain physical control while attempting to articulate their rage." The inspector nodded slowly. "We've been attempting to match the handwriting without success thus far. It doesn't correspond to any of our primary suspects." "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested carefully, "that is because the individual who wrote this letter was not present at the festival. Or perhaps they were present, but not among those you have primarily focused upon." As they examined the remaining documents, Miss Marple found her attention repeatedly drawn to a particular detail, a notation in Howard Blackwell's own handwriting, appearing in the margin of one document. It was a single word, leverage. "I believe," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "that you should examine Mr. Blackwell's banking records with considerable care. I suspect you will discover that he had been making regular payments to someone whose identity he wished to conceal, someone other than the individuals you have already identified. The inspector's expression registered both interest and skepticism. You think there was yet another victim of Blackwell's manipulations? I think, Miss Marple replied, that Howard Blackwell was a man who understood the nature of leverage with considerable intimacy. He would not have been content with merely one or two sources of control. The question is not how many people had motive to murder him, but rather which of these individuals finally reached the point where self-preservation or desperation overcame caution and fear. They departed the study as the afternoon light was beginning to slant through the windows at a lower angle, casting long shadows across the furniture. Miss Marple found herself thinking of the punch glass, of the careful calculation that must have been required to ensure the sedative was administered without detection, of the deliberation required to conceal oneself within the copse and await the moment when opportunity and necessity converged. Someone in Thornfield had made a choice that had required both planning and courage. The question now was whether that same person possessed the ability to live with the consequences of that choice, or whether some additional revelation would force the matter toward its inevitable conclusion. The banking records, when examined with the thoroughness that Miss Marple's suggestion had prompted, revealed a pattern that had previously escaped notice. Beginning approximately 2 years prior, Howard Blackwell had been making regular monthly payments to an account held in the name of a solicitor based in the neighboring town of Ashford, a different Ashford from Timothy, though the coincidence was notable. Further investigation revealed that these payments had been routed through an intermediary, suggesting that Blackwell wished to obscure the connection between himself and the recipient. Inspector Crane arrived at Miss Marple's cottage on the 5th day following the murder, his expression suggesting that his investigation had taken a turn that he found both troubling and illuminating. He carried with him a file containing photographs and documents that he spread across her small sitting-room table with the careful deliberation of someone arranging evidence for scrutiny. The solicitor in question, he explained, is one Mr. Edward Cartwright, aged 57, unmarried, and apparently engaged in a rather specialized practice. Upon further examination, it appears that Mr. Cartwright has been serving as an intermediary for certain individuals who wish to retrieve documents or information that might otherwise remain in the possession of others. A document recovery specialist, Miss Marple observed. In other words, a man who assists people in obtaining leverage over their adversaries. Precisely so, the inspector confirmed. And it would appear that Howard Blackwell had engaged Mr. Cartwright's services on more than one occasion. The payments we discovered suggest a relationship spanning several years, with regular retainers being paid for ongoing services. Then the question becomes, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, whether Mr. Cartwright might have felt aggrieved by some aspect of his arrangement with Mr. Blackwell. Whether their professional relationship might have deteriorated to the point where murder seemed an acceptable resolution. The inspector shook his head slowly. That's the peculiar aspect of this discovery. When we contacted Mr. Cartwright to question him regarding his relationship with Blackwell, we discovered that he had been in London on the day of the festival, attending to business with verifiable witnesses. He could not possibly have been present in Thornfield. And yet, Miss Marple mused, Mr. Cartwright would have possessed considerable knowledge of Howard Blackwell's activities, his methods, and his vulnerabilities. One wonders whether he might have shared such knowledge with someone else, someone who had their own reasons for wishing Mr. Blackwell harm. This observation prompted the inspector to reconsider his approach to the investigation from a somewhat different angle. If Howard Blackwell had indeed engaged in a form of blackmail that extended beyond the individuals Miss Marple had identified, it suggested the possibility of a more complex web of relationships and motivations than had previously been apparent. It was during this period of renewed investigation that Eleanor Hartley disappeared. The discovery of her absence sent a shock through Thornfield that rivaled the initial discovery of Howard Blackwell's body. Dr. Hartley, arriving at his daughter's room in the morning to find her bed unslept in and her personal effects arranged in a manner suggesting deliberate departure, immediately contacted Constable Ashford. Within hours, a search had been organized, and within further hours, Eleanor's abandoned bicycle had been discovered near the old mill on the village's outskirts. Miss Marple received the news with an expression of grave concern, though she noted with some interest the particular way in which various villagers reacted to the news. Timothy Ashford appeared genuinely distressed, his solicitor's mind immediately grasping at the implications of Eleanor's disappearance. Margaret Blackwell seemed oddly unsurprised, as though she had half expected some such development. And Constance Ashford, when Miss Marple observed her from her garden gate, was notably absent from the initial gathering of concerned neighbours, a detail that struck Miss Marple as worthy of consideration. Inspector Crane, when he arrived at Miss Marple's cottage for what had become their regular consultations, appeared thoroughly perplexed by this new complication. "The girl has vanished without apparent explanation," he said, pacing the small sitting room with visible agitation. "Her father reports that she had seemed unusually withdrawn in recent days, though he attributed this to the distress occasioned by the murder investigation. He has no idea where she might have gone or what might have prompted her departure. And yet," Miss Marple observed, "there must be some precipitating event. Eleanor did not simply decide to abandon her home and her life without cause. Something must have occurred that convinced her that departure was preferable to remaining in Thornfield. A fear of incrimination," the inspector suggested. "Perhaps her involvement in the mill worker's situation led her to some knowledge regarding the murder?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed, though her tone suggested some reservation regarding this hypothesis. "Or perhaps Eleanor discovered something about the true nature of Howard Blackwell's activities, something that implicated not merely her father or Timothy Ashford, but someone else entirely." As evening descended upon the village, Miss Marple found herself returning once more to her notebooks, searching through the accumulated observations of years for some detail that might illuminate the current crisis. And there, among entries from nearly a year prior, she discovered something that she had initially categorized as inconsequential, but which now seemed to carry considerable significance. She had noted, at a village medical charity event, an exchange between Eleanor Hartley and Howard Blackwell. Nothing explicit, merely a conversation that had appeared to trouble Eleanor considerably. Blackwell had seemed to be explaining something, his manner almost paternalistic, while Eleanor had grown progressively paler. Miss Marple closed her notebook slowly, her expression thoughtful. If her suspicions were correct, then Eleanor's disappearance was not the consequence of the murder, but rather its cause. The girl had not fled because she feared incrimination, but because she had finally understood the truth of what Howard Blackwell had been doing, and that understanding had proven too terrible to bear. Eleanor Hartley was discovered 2 days later, in a small cottage situated approximately 5 miles from Thornfield, on the road leading toward the coastal town of Ashworth. She was alive, though considerably distressed, and she was in the company of James Garrett, the mill worker to whom she had been secretly engaged. The young couple had apparently fled in the hope of beginning their lives anew, away from the complications and constraints of village society. When questioned regarding the reasons for her flight, Eleanor's responses were initially confused and fragmentary. It was only after considerable gentle persuasion from both Inspector Crane and Miss Marple, who had insisted upon being present during the interrogation, that the full nature of her knowledge began to emerge. "I didn't understand at first," Eleanor explained, her voice trembling with the residual shock of her discovery. "When Father forbade my engagement to James, I thought it was merely his snobbery regarding James's social position. But then I began to wonder why Father had become so adamant, so utterly opposed to any possibility of reconciliation. It wasn't like him. He's always been gentle, always reasonable. And what caused you to understand his true motivation?" Miss Marple asked softly. Eleanor's composure fractured visibly. "I found a letter. Father had left it in his study, and I was searching for some evidence of his thoughts regarding my engagement. Instead, I found a letter from Mr. Blackwell. It was dated from approximately 3 months prior, and it contained allegations regarding Father." "Terrible allegations. What manner of allegations?" The inspector prompted. "That Father had been inappropriate with a young patient years ago. That Mr. Blackwell possessed documentation of this incident and was prepared to make the matter public. unless father cooperated with his demands. The letter was written in such a way that it was clearly blackmail, and it was clearly designed to ensure father's complete obedience in all matters. Miss Marple and the inspector exchanged a glance of understanding. Here, then, was the hidden motivation that had seemed to elude them. Dr. Hartley's opposition to Eleanor's engagement had not been motivated by social snobbery, but by desperation to maintain control over his circumstances. He had been attempting to keep Eleanor close, presumably to protect her from discovering the nature of the blackmail that he was enduring. And how die? "You respond when you discovered this letter?" Miss Marple inquired. "I was horrified," Eleanor said. "Not because I believed the allegations. I didn't. I don't. But because I understood that father was being manipulated and tormented by Mr. Blackwell. I understood that my own desires had become a secondary concern to father's need to maintain his reputation and his practice. I felt as though I had become a prisoner in my own home, held captive to ensure father's compliance with Mr. Blackwell's demands." "When did you make this discovery?" the inspector asked. "The day before the festival," Eleanor replied. "I spent the entire night reading and rereading that letter, trying to comprehend what it meant, what I should do about it. By morning, I had resolved to confront father directly, but when I attempted to speak with him, he denied everything, claimed that the letter was a forgery, insisted that I must have misunderstood its contents. He refused to discuss the matter further and forbade me from making any reference to it." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "And did you attend the festival?" "Yes, I did." Father insisted upon it, apparently determined to maintain the appearance of normalcy. James was there as well, working among the attendees. I remember seeing father and Mr. Blackwell in conversation near the vegetable displays. They seemed to be discussing something of consequence, their manner quite intense. "And afterward?" Miss Marple pressed gently. Eleanor's hands twisted together in her lap. "Afterward, I saw father speaking with Mr. Blackwell once more, near the copse of beech trees. They had moved away from the main gathering, and their conversation seemed quite urgent. I was concerned, so I positioned myself where I could observe them without being directly noticed. I saw Mr. Blackwell hand something to father, a glass, I think, containing some substance. Father refused it at first, but Mr. Blackwell was insistent. Finally, father accepted the glass and drank from it. The significance of this observation hung in the air between them. The sedative that had been administered to Howard Blackwell had not been given to him by the person who would ultimately murder him. Rather, it appeared that Blackwell had been attempting to administer the sedative to someone else entirely. I didn't understand what was happening," Eleanor continued, her voice becoming increasingly strained. "I thought father might have been engaged in some scheme to incapacitate Mr. Blackwell, to render him unconscious, so that they could speak without interruption. But then father began to look unsteady, and I realized that the substance had been meant for him, not for Mr. Blackwell." "What transpired then?" the inspector asked. "I was about to reveal myself and intervene when I heard a sound, a cry of surprise or pain. I couldn't quite determine which. I rushed forward and found Mr. Blackwell lying on the ground, the letter opener protruding from his chest, and father standing over him, looking utterly bewildered. James was there too, though I hadn't realized he had followed me. He took in the scene immediately and understood what it would appear to mean." Eleanor paused, her breathing becoming increasingly rapid as she approached the climax of her account. "James pulled me away from the scene and told me that we had to leave immediately. He said that if father was found standing over Mr. Blackwell's body with a weapon in hand, no one would believe that he hadn't committed the murder. He said that the sedative father had consumed would make his memory of events unclear, would make his account seem unreliable. He said that if I remained in Thornfield, I would be forced to choose between my father and the truth, and that such a choice would destroy me." "Me?" S.S. Marple closed her eyes briefly, comprehending the full complexity of what had occurred. "And did you see who actually wielded the letter opener, who actually struck down Mr. Blackwell?" Eleanor's answer came barely above a whisper. "I didn't see it clearly. Everything happened very quickly. But in that moment, before James pulled me away, I caught a glimpse of movement from the shadows near the largest beech tree. Someone was there, someone other than father and Mr. Blackwell. And when I looked at James's face, I realized that he was not surprised by that presence. He was, in fact, expecting it. The revelation that James Garrett had possessed prior knowledge of events at the festival fundamentally restructured the investigation's architecture. Inspector Crane's initial impulse was to place Garrett under immediate arrest, but Miss Marple's intervention prompted a more measured approach to questioning. "We must ascertain," she said quietly, "whether Mr. Garrett was merely present at a crucial moment or whether he was actively engaged in the commission of the crime. The distinction is not merely legal but profoundly moral." James Garrett, when finally brought into formal questioning, presented himself with a quiet dignity that seemed incongruous with his social position. He was a man of 28, with calloused hands and a bearing that suggested both intelligence and considerable self-control. When confronted with Eleanor's account of his presence at the murder scene, he did not deny it, though he offered no immediate confession either. "I was present," he acknowledged. "But I did not strike the blow that killed Howard Blackwell. I was there to ensure that Eleanor was safe, to remove her from the vicinity if circumstances required such action." "And how did you come to anticipate that circumstances would require such action?" the inspector demanded. Garrett's hesitation was brief but meaningful. "Because Dr. Hartley had come to me the evening before the festival and informed me of the blackmail. He was attempting, I believe, to explain to me why he could not sanction my engagement to Eleanor. He told me about the letter, about Blackwell's threats, about the impossible position in which he found himself." "And your response?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "My response was anger," Garrett said quietly. "Anger at a man who would use another person's vulnerability as a means of controlling his behavior. Anger at a system that allows such manipulation to flourish. But Dr. Hartley specifically requested that I do nothing, that I allow him to manage the situation through legitimate legal means. He said he was prepared to confront Blackwell at the festival and attempt to negotiate a resolution." "Yet you positioned yourself to observe this confrontation," the inspector noted. "I positioned myself to ensure Eleanor's safety," Garrett corrected. "Dr. Hartley had been deeply distressed when he spoke to me. I was concerned that his emotional state might lead to actions he would regret. I intended merely to observe from a distance, ready to intervene if circumstances appeared to require it." "And did circumstances require your intervention?" Miss Marple asked. Garrett's composure remained intact, but something flickered across his expression, a moment of genuine anguish that suggested the weight of secrets he had been carrying. "I arrived at the cops to find Dr. Hartley appearing increasingly unsteady on his feet. Mr. Blackwell had just handed him the glass containing the sedative. I watched as Dr. Hartley drank from it, understanding even then that something had gone terribly wrong with whatever plan Dr. Hartley had conceived." "And then?" the inspector pressed. "And then everything happened very quickly," Garrett said. "Someone else, Emma. Jed from the shadows. I didn't immediately recognize who it was. I was focused on Eleanor, who had just appeared and was moving toward her father. I was attempting to pull her away to safety when I heard the cry. When I turned, I saw Mr. Blackwell falling and understood that the person in the shadows had acted." "Who was this person?" the inspector demanded. Garrett met his gaze directly. "I believe you already know. I believe Miss Marple already knows. And I suspect that you both understand why I have remained silent regarding this matter." The inspector's frustration was evident, but Miss Marple simply inclined her head slightly. "You recognized the killer but remained silent because you understood the nature of their motivation. You believed that their action, while illegal, was not morally indefensible." "I believed," Garrett said carefully, "that some circumstances justify the taking of extraordinary measures. I believed that a person who had been victimized in the way that person had been victimized might be forgiven for acting without regard for legal consequence." After Garrett's statement, Miss Marple requested a private consultation with Inspector Crane. They withdrew to the vicar's study, a small room lined with theological texts and decorated in the austere manner befitting a man of the cloth. "We must now examine the hidden victim," Miss Marple said without preamble. "Someone whose suffering at Howard Blackwell's hands was so profound that another person was willing to commit murder to prevent its continuation." The inspector consulted his notes. We have identified multiple victims of Blackwell's blackmail. Dr. Hartley, Timothy Ashford, the mill workers whose wages were diverted. None of these individuals were in a position to commit the murder. And yet, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, there is one individual whose suffering we have not adequately examined. One person whose connection to Blackwell was neither financial nor professional but deeply personal. One person for whom murder would represent not merely an act of justice, but an act of desperate protection. Understanding began to dawn across the inspector's features. Margaret Blackwell, Miss Marple confirmed. Howard's cousin, his heir, and, if I am not mistaken, his victim in a manner far more profound than mere financial manipulation. Consider the implications of her relationship with Timothy Ashford, which Howard used to maintain control over Timothy's professional activities. Consider her isolation, her apparent lack of any meaningful social connections beyond the village circle. Consider the particular way in which she wept when the body was discovered. Not with the sorrow of grief, but with the anguish of someone whose carefully constructed facade had suddenly shattered. But she was not present at the festival when the murder occurred. The inspector protested. Was she not? Miss Marple replied. Or did she merely position herself in such a way that her presence was not immediately obvious? Consider that she knew of her cousin's plan to sedate Dr. Hartley. Consider that she understood exactly where and when this confrontation would take place. Consider that she had access to the letter opener, which had been removed from Blackwell's study and carried to the festival specifically for this purpose. The inspector's expression shifted as the implications of Miss Marple's reasoning began to crystallize. You believe Margaret Blackwell is the murderer. I believe, Miss Marple said gently, that Margaret Blackwell is a woman driven to the edge of endurance by years of manipulation and control, and that the festival provided her with an opportunity to reclaim her agency and her dignity. Whether that constitutes justification for murder is a question for the courts to answer, but it is a question that will require a considerable amount of evidence before any answer can be given. Inspector Crane's approach to confronting Margaret Blackwell was, by necessity, considerably more delicate than might have been employed with a suspect of lesser social standing. He arrived at the Blackwell house late in the afternoon, accompanied by Miss Marple, who had insisted upon witnessing the interview. Margaret received them in the formal drawing-room, her composure apparently unshaken by the inspector's official presence, though her hands betrayed her anxiety through their continued trembling. I believe, the inspector began carefully, that you have been less than forthcoming regarding certain aspects of your knowledge of the events surrounding your cousin's death. I have answered every question posed to me with complete honesty, Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the evidence of her emotional distress. If you believe otherwise, I would welcome the opportunity to clarify any misunderstandings. The letter opener that was used to murder your cousin, the inspector said, producing the weapon from a small evidence bag, was removed from your cousin's study some time before the festival. The study was locked, and access to it was restricted to immediate family and household staff. Can you account for your movements during the period when this object might have been removed? Margaret's gaze shifted briefly toward Miss Marple before returning to the inspector. I cannot with absolute certainty establish my whereabouts during every moment of every day. I was in my own home for much of the week preceding the festival. I was alone, as I frequently am. And yet, Miss Marple interjected softly, you were not at the festival itself until late in the afternoon, despite having assisted in the preparations for the event. You did not arrive until after the murder had already been committed. Can you explain this absence? Margaret's composure finally showed signs of genuine fracturing. Her hands clenched in her lap, and when she spoke again, her voice was noticeably strained. I was indisposed. I experienced a headache and preferred to rest at home rather than expose myself to the noise and activity of the festival. A headache that prevented you from attending the event you had helped to organize, the inspector mused. Yet by all accounts, you appeared in perfect health when you arrived at the festival in the late afternoon. A remarkably swift recovery. What followed was an extended period of careful questioning, in which the inspector presented a carefully constructed narrative based upon Eleanor's account and the logical implications of Margaret's movements. He suggested that Margaret had known of her cousin's plan to seduce Dr. Hartley with the sedative, had recognized the opportunity this presented, and had positioned herself to act when circumstances aligned. Margaret remained silent throughout this recitation, her expression becoming increasingly distant, as though she were contemplating some internal landscape that neither the inspector nor Miss Marple could access. When the inspector finally concluded his presentation of the evidence against her, Margaret rose slowly from her chair and walked to the window overlooking the village gardens. "You must understand," she said at last, her voice barely audible, "that Howard did not simply blackmail people. He destroyed them. He took whatever vulnerability or weakness he discovered and transformed it into a tool for his own aggrandizement. He was not content with mere financial gain or professional advantage. He required absolute dominion over the individuals he targeted. And you were one such individual, Miss Marple. Preserved gently, Margaret turned to face them, and her expression revealed the full weight of the suffering she had endured. "My relationship with Timothy Ashford occurred when I was young and foolish, when I believed that love and passion might transcend social conventions and family obligations. When that relationship ended, I accepted it as the cost of my youthful indiscretion. But Howard could not allow the matter to rest. He used knowledge of my affair to maintain control over Timothy's professional activities, and he used that same knowledge to control me." "How did he control you?" the inspector asked. "By threatening to expose the affair publicly, thereby destroying my reputation and my standing in the village. But more fundamentally, by making it clear that as long as Timothy remained under his thumb, I would never be free. I would be forever bound to a man I no longer loved, forever trapped in a web of secrets and lies, forever unable to build any life of my own beyond the confines of his manipulation." Miss Marple moved slightly closer. "And when you discovered that he intended to extend this pattern of control to Eleanor Hartley, you determined that the cycle must end. When I learned that Howard had begun to collect information regarding Eleanor, that he intended to use her as a means of securing Dr. Hartley's complete obedience, I understood that the time for patience had passed," Margaret said quietly. "I understood that if I did not act, another young woman would be condemned to the same existence of fear and constraint that I had endured for years." "So you removed the letter opener from the study," the inspector said, "and you positioned yourself near the cops in anticipation of the confrontation you knew would occur between your cousin and Dr. Hartley." "I intended merely to threaten him," Margaret said, her voice becoming almost plaintive. "I intended to convince him to abandon his schemes, to release Dr. Hartley from his blackmail, to cease his predatory behavior toward Eleanor. I carried the letter opener as a means of demonstrating the seriousness of my purpose, but I did not intend to use it." "And yet you did use it," the inspector observed. Margaret's hands moved to cover her face, and when she spoke again, her words came through trembling fingers. "When he saw me there, when he understood that I had discovered his intentions regarding Eleanor, he laughed. He actually laughed, and said that I was in no position to threaten him, that I had no leverage whatsoever against his plans. He said that Eleanor would become compliant just as I had become compliant, that there was nothing I could do to prevent it." She lowered her hands, and her eyes were now filled with a desperate intensity. "He was moving toward me, saying terrible things about what he intended to do to that innocent girl, and something broke inside me. Not my resolve, but something deeper, some fundamental aspect of my capacity to endure. And when he was distracted by Dr. Hartley's increasing unsteadiness, when he was focused on his next victim, I acted. I acted without thought, without calculation, with only the desperate certainty that the only way to stop him was to ensure that he could never hurt anyone again." Margaret Blackwell was taken into custody that evening, her confession providing the final pieces of the puzzle that Inspector Crane required to close his investigation. Yet as Miss Marple watched the inspector depart with his prisoner, she found herself experiencing not the satisfaction of a mystery solved, but rather a profound melancholy born of understanding the tragic circumstances that had culminated in murder. The village of Thornfield, in the days following Margaret's arrest, seemed to settle into a state of uneasy reflection. A revelation of Howard Blackwell's systematic predation, His blackmail schemes, his manipulation of vulnerable individuals, his deliberate campaign to ensure the complicity of those he victimized, transformed public perception of the crime from murder to something approaching an act of justice, however unlawful. Dr. Hartley, released from suspicion and freed from the weight of Blackwell's blackmail, appeared visibly diminished by the knowledge that his daughter had been positioned as a potential victim. He threw himself into his medical practice with renewed energy, as though work might somehow compensate for the years lost to fear and constraint. Eleanor, meanwhile, had secured her engagement to James Garrett with surprising swiftness, the couple apparently determined to build their lives on foundations of genuine affection rather than social convention. Timothy Ashford resumed his legal practice, though his relationship with Constance seemed to have undergone a subtle transformation. The revelation of his past affair, coupled with the exposure of his years of submission to Blackwell's control, had apparently prompted a recalibration of his marriage. Constance, for her part, seemed to have developed a greater appreciation for her husband's fundamental decency, even as she acknowledged the complexity of his moral failings. It was nearly 3 weeks after Margaret's arrest that Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. She was seated in her garden, engaged in the peaceful contemplation of her roses, when the vicar's wife, Margaret's closest friend among the village women, approached with an expression of considerable distress. "I've come because I believe you should know what Margaret's solicitor has instructed me to convey," Mrs. Whitmore said, settling herself in the chair beside Miss Marple's with visible reluctance. "Margaret has decided to plead guilty to the charge of murder. She will not contest the verdict, will not attempt to argue for mitigation based upon the circumstances surrounding her actions. She has instructed her solicitor to ensure that the evidence regarding Howard Blackwell's blackmail schemes is presented to the court, but she will accept whatever sentence is imposed without resistance." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, comprehending the full significance of Margaret's decision. It was an act of nobility born from desperation, a final assertion of agency accomplished through submission to the law's demands. "She has also instructed me to deliver a message to you," Mrs. Whitmore continued. "She wished you to know that she understood what you had deduced regarding her involvement in the murder. She wanted you to understand that she harbored no resentment toward you for your role in exposing the truth. She said that you, of all people, would comprehend that justice, even when it results in one's own condemnation, is preferable to the perpetuation of lies." Over the following months, as Margaret's case proceeded through the legal system, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the nature of justice and morality with considerably greater depth than the immediate investigation had permitted. She attended Margaret's trial, observing from the gallery as the prosecution presented its case, and as Margaret's solicitor made a restrained but effective argument regarding the circumstances that had driven his client to commit her desperate act. The judge, a man of considerable wisdom and lengthy experience, sentenced Margaret to 12 years of imprisonment, a sentence that represented both acknowledgement of the severity of her crime and recognition of the extraordinary circumstances surrounding it. As Margaret was led from the courtroom, she met Miss Marple's gaze briefly, and something passed between them, an understanding that transcended the legal verdict and spoke instead to the fundamental tragedy of human suffering and its terrible consequences. It was in the autumn following these events that Miss Marple received a letter from Margaret, written from the women's prison where she had begun her sentence. The letter was brief but profound, expressing Margaret's conviction that her imprisonment had provided her with a strange form of liberation. For the first time in years, she wrote, she was free from the necessity of maintaining a facade, free from the requirement to dissemble and conceal, free from the burden of living under another person's control. "I have committed a terrible crime," Margaret wrote, "and I do not ask for forgiveness or for understanding beyond what you have already demonstrated. But I wish you to know that in taking responsibility for my actions, I have finally reclaimed the one thing that Howard took from me years ago, my agency, my ability to determine the course of my own life. In losing my freedom, I have paradoxically become truly free." As Miss Marple set down the letter, she found herself contemplating the intricate web of human motivation and consequence that the investigation had revealed. Howard Blackwell had been a predator, certainly, But he had also been a man who had understood the darker aspects of human nature with terrible clarity. He had recognized the vulnerabilities in those around him and had exploited those vulnerabilities with systematic precision. Yet in his very success at manipulation, he had created the conditions for his own destruction. By extending his web of control too broadly, by attempting to add Eleanor Hartley to his roster of victims, he had galvanized those who loved her into action. By treating Margaret Blackwell with contempt, by assuming that years of constraint had rendered her incapable of resistance, he had misjudged the breaking point of her endurance. The village of Thornfield gradually returned to its customary rhythms, though with an air of permanent alteration. The assumption of innocence that had once characterized its social interactions had been replaced by a more cautious recognition of human complexity. People were, Miss Marple reflected, fundamentally unknowable, capable of both remarkable kindness and terrible cruelty, often simultaneously. She continued her habit of quiet observation, noting the small details of human behavior that revealed character and motivation. And when visitors occasionally asked her to reflect on the Blackwell murder, she would offer only the modest observation that the case had illuminated certain truths regarding human nature that she had long suspected but had not previously had occasion to verify so thoroughly. In the end, she would say, justice had been served not by the legal system alone, but by the recognition that sometimes, in the darkest circumstances, the most terrible choices can be understood as expressions of desperate humanity rather than simple wickedness. It was a conclusion that brought her no comfort but considerable wisdom, the wisdom born of observing life in all its complexity, its contradictions, and its tragic beauty.